Hello and welcome to our second WPS YouTube video on the Worksheet S-10 audits. In this follow-up video, we're going to be talking about a revision that has been made to the Worksheet S-10 standard data request template. The revisions are mostly minor and cosmetic as far as some of the instructions, some of the column headings. However, we will talk about a new questionnaire tab that's been added. So let's dig into this. First of all, I want to mention with the instructions tab, you'll see that for the most part this is the same, except that we have revised some of the column headings. Now these column headings flow over to the individual worksheet tabs, the total charity care, patient payments, total hospital bad debt. Some of these columns have been revised to add more clarity and in some cases add a note reference. The notes have been moved to the bottom of this worksheet. Previously, there was only one note. Now we have multiple notes to explain certain items. So if we take a look at note 1, now this is the note that existed all along. We're going to see these notes and we're going to see the columns in the worksheet tabs that they actually relate to. So note 1 is a situation where if your hospital tracks the professional fees and physician charges in a separate system, then you do not have to provide the revenue code detail that you normally would on the charity care tab, and for that matter, the bad debt tab. The main reason that revenue code detail is required to begin with is to allow us to audit the listing to make sure that any sort of professional fees or physician charges that are not allowable have been properly removed. If they're in a completely different system, then that level of detail is not needed. We need to be able to have assurance that that data is indeed kept in a separate system. So there may be more follow-up questions on that if that is the case in your provider. But in any case, if that is the situation, you do not need to provide that revenue code detail. Again, we'll get to that when we look at each individual tab. So it's best to indicate that on your actual cover letter when you submit the requested documentation. Note 2, this one we'll talk about in the tab itself. The total charges in column O of the total charity care tab should generally equal the sums of columns P, Q, R, and S. So total charges, and then P, Q, R, and S are the patient payments, insurance payments, charity care write-offs, and other contractual allowances. Basically, those four columns help to explain what happened to all those total charges. Now, the only thing that you're going to see that's actually reported on Worksheet S-10 would be the charity care charges. However, these 5 columns in total are needed to help assure that the proper amount remains in charity care. That's the amount that's been reported on Worksheet S-10 line 20. So we'll see that in just a bit. Now, the other thing I want to point out, though, any excess of total charges over the sum of these columns, so in other words, if P, Q, R, and S do not add up to column O, let's say P, Q, R, and S, when you add them up, they come up to $750, but column O is $1,000. The question then would be, what happened to that other $250? That excess $250 may relate to a patient liability that has not yet been paid or written off to charity care. So there's still an amount out there that is expected to be paid by the patient. They just haven't paid it yet. So it's not in columns P, Q, R, and S. It's not there yet. Now, eventually, at some point, we hope it would be a patient payment, or at some point, it might be a charity care write-off, or possibly even a bad debt write-off. So that could happen. Now, in no case, however, should these 4 columns exceed the total charges on column O. It doesn't make sense that you can have more of the component than you do the total. So let's take a look at that now. Again, on the total charity care tab, the worksheet tab, most of the column headings are the same as they were before. The changes we made were to some of these in columns N through S, and actually I think a little bit of T as well. We just added a little bit of clarity to the columns so it's clear what we're looking for with that information. However, we also did move the write-off date. Before, it was between a couple of these amounts. We moved it over here before any of this information. So now you have, again, column O would be your revenue code total charges for the claim. Note 1, remember it said that if you don't need to provide this revenue code detail, then you're only going to have one line for every claim. If you do have to provide that revenue code detail because your professional and physician charges are commingled with the rest of the charges, then one particular claim might have multiple lines. Total patient payments. So out of these total charges, how much did the patient pay? What were any third-party payments? Again, column R is really what we're looking for. Patient charity approved amount. Out of these total charges, how much was approved for charity? So that'd be column R. That goes on worksheet S-10 line 20. And then we have other contractual amounts, insurance write-offs, courtesy, discounts, things like that. Now notice column T here. Column T, it says non-covered charges for days exceeding the length of stay limit for patients covered by Medicaid or other indigent care. So this amount, this column T, if it exists, is actually also part of your charity care approved amount. So this is not, you don't add this along with the other ones to equal column O. Column T would be part of column R. In fact, when you look at the cost report worksheet S-10, line 20 reflects the patient charity care approved amounts, whether it's insured or uninsured. Column T actually reflects the amount that's reported in line 25. So column T has its own line, as you'll see here on worksheet S-10. Again, line 20, charity care charges and uninsured discounts. You have column 1, which is the uninsured patients. Column 2, which represents insured patients. Now, normally speaking, insured patients, we would think of deductibles, co-insurance, and co-payments. That's what would be reported in column 2. There normally should not be charges reported in column 2. However, the one exception is with this length of stay limit for Medicaid and other indigent care programs. In that situation, the patient themselves is covered, so they're insured. It's just those additional days past the length of stay limit that are technically not covered. So that amount would be a charge. And in line 24, you have to report that charge amount. That charge amount also needs to be included in line 20. So in that situation alone, line 20, column 2, is going to be comprised of a lot of deductibles, co-insurance, and co-payments, plus it'll have a small amount of charges relating to these specific patients that exceeded that length of stay limit for Medicaid. So the portion of line 20, column 2, that equals charges, that should be this amount that's on line 24. That should be the only difference. In other words, the cost report software should be able to identify how much of line 20 was a charge amount, and of course the rest of it would have been co-payment, co-insurance, deductible. The reason that's important is that any charge amount that's included in line 2 is subject to a cost to charge ratio reduction, but any co-insurance or deductible amount is not subject to that. So it's important to report line 24 properly and also ensure that that amount is part of line 20, column 2. That'll ensure that this cost of charity care, line 23, column 2, that will ensure that it's calculated properly. So again, that is the purpose of this column T. We're going to see that in note 5 for more clarity. So that was note 2, just explaining the purpose of each of those columns and how they reconcile to column O. Note 3, the payments included in the total patient payments columns of two different tabs, the total charity care tab and the total hospital bad debt tab, that amount, that payment amount, should relate to all payments made by the patient against the entire claim. Now, it doesn't really even matter what year we're talking about. The payments could have been made across 2 years. For example, you could have had a claim in 2018, let's say, for service dates in 2018. It wasn't written off to charity care until 2019. 2019 is where we should see this reported on line 20, because it's the period of write-off that matters, not the service date period. However, in that situation, let's say at the end of 2018, the patient may have made a certain payment. And then in 2019, they made some more payments, and finally some remaining amount was written off to charity care. So note 3 is just saying that that total patient payments column should reflect all payments made by the patient. It's not intended to be the amount they paid against a charity care. It's the amount they paid against the entire claim. That's what it should be. For that reason, this patient payment amount is not the amount that should be reported on S-10 line 22. S-10 line 22 reflects payments received from patients for amounts previously written off as charity care. So it's only patient payments that they really necessarily didn't have to make because the amount was already written off to charity care. If the patient still decided to make a payment against an amount that was written off as charity care in a prior year, that's the amount that would be reported on line 22. Again, that does not match what's reported on this column. The total patient payments column, that's just the payment amount they made. And again, the whole purpose of it is to reconcile those revenue code total charges to help explain what happened to them. Just want to reiterate, this amount on the total charity care or total hospital bad debt tabs, this patient payment amount is not what goes on worksheet line 22. The worksheet line 22 amount will come specifically from this patient payments tab, which we'll explain in just a bit. So note 4. This is the amount that should be reported on worksheet S-10 line 20. All amounts included in this column must be related to write-offs that were in accordance with your financial assistance or charity care policy. So let's take a look at where note 4 is. And we've said this before, it's the patient charity care approved amount. It says see note 4. This column right here is what goes on worksheet S-10 line 20. That's all we're looking for. The other columns just help support or explain that amount. And again, any amount you report there, it's only allowable if your financial assistance policy or your charity care policy explicitly allows that type of amount. Note 5. Now, just to give you an idea where note 5 was, that was that non-covered charges for days exceeding the length of stay limit. And again, that is just for Medicaid or other indigent care patients. It's a very limited column. And as we said, that amount, which is a charge amount by its nature, that would be reported on worksheet S-10 line 25. And that same amount should be part of the amount reported on S-10 line 20 column 2. So they're merged with the other coinsurance and deductible amounts that would otherwise be reported in the insured column, column 2, of worksheet S-10 line 20. So that one we've already explained a little bit. Note 6, as we'll see, comes from this patient payments column. And again, let me just explain this patient payments this tab. Most of the information is the same, the identifying information about the claim. But now, column N says the amount of cash collected this period that related to charity care write-offs from a prior period. So, two things that are important. It's a collection this period, in this cost reporting period that you're reporting on right now, but it has to be related to a charity care write-off from a prior period. The rule is that if this charity care was written off this year, and then a month later, still in this year, the patient decided to pay against that charity care amount. So even though it was already approved for charity care and the patient was no longer liable for it, if the patient still decided to pay against that amount, but it's in the same period, what should happen is neither the charity care charge nor the payment should be reported. Both of them should be removed from Worksheet S-10. It was a same period recovery, so to speak, a same period payment, and it should be netted out of the cost report entirely. However, if the charity care write-off was from a prior period, then of course that write-off would have already been reported, so now we need to report the payment. It's not expected these will be very big amounts, because again, the patient has already had their liability reduced due to that being written off as charity care. So that's what Note 6 is about. In that situation where there is actually a payment like this, we want to know, column O, what were the total hospital charges for those services in question? Were there any total physician or professional charges for those services in question? Now, part of the reason for this is one of the questions is, does this payment, what does it relate to? Does it relate to hospital charges that could have been allowed as charity care? Or might it relate to professional or physician charges that were not allowed for charity care? So that's one of the things we're questioning. Where does it go? Do we need to report it on line 22, or does it relate to something else? We also want to know, what was the date of original write-off to charity care related to this payment? So again, this payment is being made in 2019. Was the original charity care it related to written off in 2018? That's what we're looking for. And column R, what cost reporting period was that charity care claimed on line 20? If the charity care was not claimed, was not allowed, then of course the payment itself doesn't need to be reported in a later year. We only report the payment if there was a charity care amount approved and reported in a prior year, because then it's an offset to that earlier amount. Column 5, this is the patient liability on the claim. Now again, in many cases the patient was not written off as 100% charity care, so there might be a portion that they were actually liable for. We want to know if some of that cash payment related to their patient liability, then that amount should not be reported on line 20. They actually owed that, so there's no reason to offset that now. Now remember, this patient liability, any payment against this patient liability, that would have showed up on the other two worksheets in total patient payments, but it should not show up here. We don't want that payment if it was normally related to their patient liability. So that's the only reason we're putting this here, is just to help explain how much of this payment is really against a charity care write-off. It's just putting the pieces together. So what was the original patient liability on that claim? And were there any bad debt amounts written off on that claim? Now, if a particular claim had some patient liability, but it also had some charity care write-off, and then also some bad debt write-off. The patient was required to pay some of the claim, but they didn't. So it was written off to a bad debt. We want to know that amount. And the reason that's important is that if any payment comes in later, the first place it would be charged against is your bad debt. It would be considered a bad debt recovery. And of course, that would not be reported on line 22 because it did not relate to a charity care amount. It was not an offset against a charity care amount. It was an offset against a bad debt. It was a bad debt recovery. So that explains the purpose for this tab and all of these columns. But really, again, Note 6 was what we were talking about there. Note 6 just says pretty much what I talked about. It should not relate to patients made against charity care write-offs in the current period. Both the current year payment and current year charity care charge should be removed. So now let's talk about Note 7. That's the hospital bad debt tab. Note 7, the patient charity care amount in column Q of the total hospital bad debt tab should reflect all charity care ever approved for the claim, even if it was in a prior period. This does not necessarily reflect the amount reported on line 20 in this current year. It's included here solely to help explain any adjustments made against the total charges. So let's take a look at column Q. Patient charity care approved amount. Again, this is just explaining what happened out of these revenue code total charges what happened to all those charges. Some might have been paid by either the patient or the third party. Some amount might have been approved for charity care at some point in the past. And then there might be some remaining bad debt amount. This is the amount we're looking for line 26. And that takes us to the end of the notes for this template. So now the other change to this template that I wanted to explain would be the questionnaire tab. One of the things you're going to be asked during an audit to submit is an explanation of your query logic. In other words, as you understand all the rules of Worksheet S-10, how did you query your system to make sure that the write-off dates were in the right period, that you've only included the proper amounts, things like that. Now, the phrase query logic is a little ambiguous. We've had some questions on what exactly that means. So we've put together this questionnaire to help explain the certain things we're looking for as far as this query logic. We believe this will serve as a good tool for both providers and auditors. It should help to explain what we're really looking for in certain columns in these worksheets altogether. So let's walk through this. First of all, we start off with some basic information about the provider. But then we have a section for each of the three tabs: charity care, payments, and bad debts. So question 1. How did you generate your listing to ensure it only included charity care amounts that were actually written off to charity care in this cost reporting period, regardless of when the underlying service dates were? So it's all a timing issue. There might be situations where the charity care service dates were in 2018, for example, but it was written off in 2019. That's the period. That 2019 is the period where these should show up. The service date itself does not drive cutoff or when it should be reported. Question 2. How did you ensure that no charity care was written off in both the current year and in any prior years? Explain if your policy and or practice allows for partial charity care to be written off in one year with additional charity care for the same claim being written off in a later year. As an example, you have a $1,000 charge and the patient was approved in 2019 for $250 of charity care. So there's still $750 that would have to be reported somewhere else as a payment, as another contractual. They've been approved for $250 this year, but then let's say in the next year they're approved for a little bit more, another $100 of charity care for that same claim. That's what we're asking for here, because if we were to do a search for that patient and the dates of service, that particular claim, it would show up in two separate years, which of course increases the risk of a duplication. So we're asking you, how did you ensure that this was not truly a duplicate? And if that same claim shows up in 2 years, how did you ensure that the total amount reported across those 2 years did not exceed the claim amount? That it wasn't reported twice. The same amounts weren't reported twice. So that's what we're asking for. We're also wanting to know, does your policy even allow this? Question 3, what transaction codes or other codes are used in your operations to identify those charity care write-offs as opposed to other contractual adjustments? We want to know in that listing, when we're looking at that detail for that particular claim, how can we identify that, yes, you have the proper charity care write-off amount, because this code is what your system uses for charity care. That's how you report that charity care write-off. Question 4, what methods are used to ensure there were no claims reported in both the charity care listing and the bad debt listing? Again, there might be a situation where part of that claim was written off to charity care, but then part of it was written off to bad debt. So similar to question 2, we want to know what methodology, what query logic are you using to ensure that the same claim is not reported in total twice. So that if it is both a charity care and a bad debt, how do you ensure that the total amount of those two does not exceed the allowable amount of the entire claim? That's question 4. Question 5, do you have any Medicare patients that are reported as charity care on line 20? So line 20 reflects the charity care charges. These are different than bad debts. They're different than indigent bad debts even. So with Medicare patients, anytime we see that on line 20, there's a big risk because most providers would generally report an amount as Medicare bad debt on either worksheet E Part A, E Part B, or any of the Medicare settlement worksheets. They'd report that amount there. So it would be somewhat unusual to see it reported as a charity care instead. That being said, it's not a situation that is not allowable. It's just much higher risk. The risk is duplication as both Medicare bad debt and charity care. We want to ensure that duplication is not occurring, so that's what we're asking for. How did you ensure through your query logic that you didn't have this duplication? And furthermore, if there is a Medicare patient being written off as charity care on line 20, why was this not written off as Medicare bad debt instead? Generally speaking, the reimbursement would be preferable as Medicare bad debt. So why would that not have been written off as bad debt? Was there a reason? Did it not qualify through the more stringent Medicare bad debt criteria? Or what was the reason? Question 6, does your policy discuss allowing charity care approval for amounts related to insured patients that have exhausted their benefits? Now, I want to clarify, this is not the same situation we talked about earlier with the Medicaid length of stay limit, where they exceed that length of stay limit. This is a separate situation, and it should not be reported in the same way that that Medicaid length of stay limit was on line 25. So this is just asking whether your policy even discusses that these amounts could be allowed. So the patient is covered for a certain amount of time, and then after that they've exhausted their benefits. Question is, what happens to that excess amount after they've exhausted their benefits? If your policy allows it, then that portion can be considered non-covered or uninsured. So in that situation, you might have one claim that needs to be split across two columns. The deductibles and coinsurance related to the covered portion, the insured portion, would be in column 2 of line 20. The charges related just to that exhausted benefit portion would be reported as uninsured. Again, that's a different treatment than when it exceeds the Medicaid length of stay limit. That's intentionally a separate situation. So with question 6, we're just asking for whether this exists in your operations. Question 7 is very similar, only instead of exhausted benefits, now we're asking about non-covered services, but the treatment is the same as question 6. If you have services within a claim that are not covered, and of course we're assuming they do not relate to a professional or physician charge, which itself would not be allowable on line 20 at all. But if it's an otherwise non-covered service, then the covered portion is going to go in insured, where the non-covered portion is going to go in column 1 uninsured. So that's what we have for column 7, question 7. Question 8, does your policy discuss allowing charity care approval for amounts related to services for patients with coverage from one entity that does not have a contractual relationship with the hospital? So you might consider that patient insured, but the insurance does not work at your facility. There's no contractual relationship. So in that situation, the claim, the charges related to that claim, are going to be reported as uninsured because there arguably is no coinsurance and deductible amount. The entire amount is due from the patient. So is there a particular transaction code, insurance code, financial class, or some combination that denotes these situations? We need to identify this to be able to understand the amounts you're reporting on the template. Number 9, this is what we were talking about in the tab discussion earlier. What methods are used to identify patients with Medicaid or other indigent care program coverage that exceed the length of stay limit? How did you ensure that the charges related to only the days after the length of stay limit are included in both line 20, column 2, and line 25? That same amount is included as part of both of those cells. Question 10, have you included any amounts related to a self-pay discount for uninsured patients? If so, explain what section of your policy explicitly allows this. Again, these could potentially be allowed as part of your charity care as long as your policy allows it. Number 11, how did you ensure that no physician or professional services were included in the charity care listing? Again, if they're in a separate system altogether, you can explain that. But if they are within the same system and they're commingled with all of the other services, then what revenue codes did you use to filter those types of services out? Question 12. On the total charity care tab, the total charge column should equal the sum of the total patient payments, total third-party payments, patient charity care, and other contractual amount columns. Are there any instances where this is not the case, and if so, please explain. So we talked about that reconciliation earlier. This just adds a narrative for that. Question 13. How did you ensure that Worksheet S-10 line 20 column 2, the insured column, only contains the deductibles, coinsurance, and copay amounts related to the insured patients and not any charge or other amounts for those patients? Now again, the only exception to that is that Medicaid length of stay limit. In that case, there would be a charge portion included in that column 2, but that charge amount should itself be explained in line 25 as well. Number 14, do you employ the use of presumptive eligibility tools to determine charity care qualification? If so, explain what section of your policy, your financial assistance policy, your charity care policy, what section explicitly covers this. It's only allowable if it's very clear in your policy that it's allowable. Question 15, how did you ensure that the patient payments reported on line 22 are only those that related to a charity care amount written off in a prior cost reporting period? As a reminder, if that payment relates to an actual patient liability, then they don't need to be reported on line 22. They're reported in the total charity care and total hospital bad debt tabs, those worksheets of this template, just to help explain the amount, but it's not reported on line 22. Only the amount related to a previous charity care write-off is reported in line 22. Question 16, does your policy discuss the treatment of patient payments that are sent in for an amount that the patient is no longer liable for? In other words, that patient, let's just assume they were written off for 100% charity care. The entire amount was written off for charity care, but then the patient still decides to make a payment. How do you handle that in your facility? Does your policy explain the treatment of that? Are those amounts returned to the patient, or are they used to reverse some or all of the original charity care entry? That's what we're looking for here as an explanation. Question 17. Now we're dealing with the bad debts. How did you generate your listing to ensure that it only includes bad debt amounts actually written off as bad debts in this cost reporting period, regardless of when the underlying service dates were? Again, we need some narrative there. Question 18, are there Medicare bad debts reported in the total on line 26 that are also claimed in a different cost reporting period for Medicare bad debt reimbursement purposes? Worksheet E Part A, E Part B, any of those worksheets. Line 26 is total bad debts, which could certainly include Medicare, but then Medicare bad debts are also reimbursed on one of the other worksheets. So question 18 is specifically about whether there is a difference in the period that you're reporting these for any reason. We want an explanation on that. Question 19, how did you ensure that no bad debts were written off in both the current year and any prior years? So again, there might be a portion of the claim that was written off in 2018 as bad debt, and then another portion in 2019. If your policy allows that, and if you have that situation, how do you ensure that the total amount written off across all years doesn't exceed the total patient liability? Because the bad debt has to be derived from patient liability. They had to have owed the amount before it can be considered a bad debt. So we just want to make sure the total bad debt amount is not being duplicated. Question 20, what transaction codes are used in your operations to identify bad debt write-offs versus other contractual adjustments? 21, explain how the total bad debts reported on line 26 reconcile to write-offs derived from accounts receivable balances on your financial statements or working trial balance. Now, it's key to note that on your actual financial statements or even in your working trial balance, there is no entry anywhere for bad debt write-off. There would be a bad debt expense and there would be an accounts receivable and an allowance for bad debts potentially, but there's no actual bad debt write-off amount under GAAP. So for that reason, when we're doing this reconciliation, you're generally going to see something like this that would help explain how your prior year ending accounts receivable balance compared with the current ending accounts receivable balance, what happened? There would be some patient revenues, there would be some regular payments, and the difference for this reconciliation would be the write-off. If there were amounts that were written off, that reduces accounts receivable. Now, again, that's your current period write-offs per financial statements as derived from the financial statements. Of course, we're going to subtract out any physician or professional bad debts and potentially any bad debts related to other non-patient parties, like insurers, for example. That would arrive at your amount to be reported on line 26 of Worksheet S-10. So this is not the only format that's allowable for a reconciliation. This is just an example. If you have another way of reconciling amounts from your financial statements to what you've reported on line 26, certainly feel free to submit that as well. We just need to see how you got from one amount to the other. And finally, we have the overall section. Question 22 says, if the listings that you are providing do not correspond to the amounts you originally reported on the various lines of S-10, please provide an explanation as to why those amounts have changed. So what has changed, basically? And then line 23 is just a catch-all. If you have any other explanations you think may be helpful to the auditor, then include that here as well. So that explains this revised template. Hopefully this helps to clarify the information that we're looking for during these audits. As new clarifications come out or as new information comes out, we will certainly keep you up to date on that as well. But please let us know if you have any questions. At the very top of this template, you'll see our email address, auditadvisement@wpsic.com. Now, if you're already working with an auditor on the Worksheet S-10, go ahead and send those questions there. And if they need to escalate them for further research, they can send them to the audit advisement area. But if you have not, if you're just in the submission process, then feel free to use this email address. So I thank you for your time. And again, please let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.